I'm Mitch Frumkin, and we're going to get going in a couple of seconds. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We have a pretty large turnout of people who signed up for today. We have over 75 people who have signed up, and we have over 30 that are here now. So usually our the overbooking is usually about 20%. So I'm assuming that we may not be getting any more, so we're going to get going. The first thing I'd like to do, if I could get it to work, is I had, I guess I can't do it. I wanted to, this will take 1 second. Oh, well, why don't we do this in the chat room? Everybody knows how to use chat, because I had a couple of polling questions that I wanted to ask everybody so I can get a feel for who's here today. And for some reason, it says I'm signed in on 2 accounts, so won't let me launch the poll. So everybody knows how to work chat. On the bottom of the screen is a chat function. And if you wouldn't mind just jumping in there and just letting me know from, what role you play in your community. Are you a manager? Are you a board member? Are you a homeowner? Are you a builder or something else? And just drop in here just what your role is as far as your community, so I can just get a feel for the audience. It seems like so far everybody's a property manager, developer. Okay, we have a developer. Don't show your name as a developer because you'll probably get a lot of questions. On the transition committee, and why I just have to make a comment on that. For some reason, when we get into transition process, a lot of people consider the builder to be the enemy. The builder is not the enemy. The builder is somebody, their goal is clearly to make money. That's what they're in business for. Their goal is to build a nice, beautiful home so you can move into it, enjoy it, and become their best salespeople. So when anybody asks you who built your community, you can say their name and say how happy you are with it. So don't consider the builder to be the enemy. Oh, look, we have 2 Kipcon employees here. Transition committee member, board member, chair of commission. Okay. So, all right, thank you. So it looks like we're primarily builders, a couple of board members, and a few builders. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to be using, obviously, on the subject of transition. And I would ask, as we're going along, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to jump in under the chat function. And you'll see that Jody Smallwood from my office is here. And as I'm going along, she's going to be monitoring the chat function to see if there's any questions that she should interrupt me with as I'm going along. And like I told her, I'm not shy. If it's something I'm going to get to, I'll say I'll get to it. And then at the end of the presentation, we will open it up for verbal questions. But I think it's a little better, at least initially, if we just do it from the chat room. So I'm assuming everybody knows how to use it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So everybody should see now the presentation. Can you all see the first slide? Move my camera over here so I'm actually looking at it while I'm talking to you. So is there anybody who cannot see this? All right, so I'm going to assume everybody can see it, everybody can hear me. And I am going to, for some reason, let's see, I just want to, okay, so let me do one more thing. All right, so we're ready to go. So again, if you have any questions, I actually can see the chat function, but Jody will jump in and interrupt me, as I'm sure, as I know. So today's topic is transition, the beginnings. And my name is Mitch Frumkin. I'm president of Kipcon. And just to give you a little bit of background as far as me and my experience with transitions, I founded Kipcon a number of years ago, but in terms of the industry and my involvement with transitions, I'm the past president of CAI National. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Community Associations Institute. I'm past president of the CAI Foundation for Community Association Research. I was president of the New Jersey chapter. I was president of the Keystone chapter of CAI, so that which is Pennsylvania. So you can see I've spent my life with CAI. And I'm going to jump over this next one for a second because I'm going to go back to it. That's something that's relatively new that definitely relates to what we're going to talk about. But the next one is A number of years ago, CAI put together a task force along with the National Association of Home Builders, which published a best practices paper on transition. That I chaired that committee just recently. That best practices paper was updated, and I chaired the task force that updated that transition paper. So what we'll do is when this program is over, we're going to send everybody a copy of the best practices paper on transition from CAI. One of the things that came out of that best practices paper is that CAI has a couple of advanced level 300 level or advanced level courses. One of them is the M370, which is managing developing communities, which is based on this best practices paper on transition, and it's offered nationally. We just offered that course about a month ago, and to show you how many transitions are going on across the country and how much interest there is, that was a paying course, and it was 2 days long, and we had about 150 people from around the country that attended the M370 class on managing developing communities, which today you'll get the benefit of really the good parts of it. That was 2 days, but I'll give you the good stuff in the next hour. Now, because I was one of the presenters of that class. It was myself, an attorney from Washington, Bob Diamond, and a manager from Houston, Margie Myers, as well as Stephen Brumfield, who's a developer. He heads up community associations for Toll Brothers nationwide, and Stephen was also one of the speakers to give a developer's perspective. When CAI developed the National Reserve Study Standards, I chaired that committee. And those standards were just updated a couple of years ago, and I chaired that when we updated it, the National Task Force. Right now, there's a CAI National Task Force updating the Reserve Study Standards again, which I'm co-chairing. And the reason we're updating it is to reflect some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So now I'm going to jump back to the beginning, and you see it says just recently, everybody's aware of the tragedy that took place in Florida, the collapse of the high-rise building in Florida. So what CAI did nationally is they were very proactive, and they developed a couple of national task forces, of which I co-chaired, and developed a book called Condominium Safety Public Policy Report that makes recommendations from an industry perspective in terms of things to do for communities so that this kind of tragedy does not happen again. We'll also send everybody a copy of this public policy report. But the public policy report is being used by legislators around the country to develop bills and laws to protect buildings so that they stay safe. And for those of you, I think a number of people here are from New Jersey. In New Jersey, the New Jersey Legislative Action Committee, which I'm on, just worked with Senator Singleton to develop a bill in the state of New Jersey, which pretty much models the recommendations in this public policy report. And that's going to be voted on, as far as I know, this coming fall in terms of building safety in New Jersey, as well as reserve studies. And I'll touch on that as part of my presentation. And the reason I say that is because it's been recognized that safety in buildings start when they're built. It doesn't start when there's a safety problem 20 years later. So included in this bill, as well as the public policy reports, are certain things that are going to be required of builders during construction, as well as communities once they take over, to maintain the safety of their communities. And that's something that I've given this presentation a few times, but there's a number of things I've recently added to this presentation about transition just related to that, because people sometimes think that the transition process is just to look at what was built wrong or what was budgeted wrong. But a big component of a transition from a developer is homeowners taking responsibility for the community and making sure going into the future that it's safe, and setting up the community going into the future. So I'm going to touch on that as part of the presentation also. My discussion topics are going to be transition, the key concepts, some of the risks, expectations, claim evaluations, some of the dangers, and strategies. And as part of the strategies at the end, there's another thing that has evolved out of the tragedy in Florida that has to do with mortgage requirements that have been put in place by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in regards to safety of communities and what you need to do in order to make sure that you can still get refinancing, do refinancing mortgage as well as new mortgages on homes. So I'm touching with one slide on what Fannie and Freddie have done and how it affects your communities. That's something also that's been added to the presentation. All right, so let's start with transition. What is it? And keep in mind, before there were community associations, there was no such thing as transition. but it's a process that starts. And the reason I say process is because a lot of people look at transition and look at the word wrong and think that that's a point in time. But transition is a process that starts when the developer first decides to build a community and continues to the point in time when the developer has no more seats on the board, all the homes are sold, and the new homeowners are in charge of the community. So it's a process. And I'm going to go through the 4 steps of the process now, which start with document development, construction, independent community, or I'm sorry, turnover, and then independent community. It was a little out of order there. I should have been going counterclockwise. All right, so what is it? That's what transition is. And the purpose of transition is to provide a mechanism for the sponsor to turn over to the community, to the new homeowners. It's a process, but it's working with the developer to come up with a way to make that, for this process to occur, as well as to establishing practices and procedures for maintaining property values and building safety in the future. Now, you'll see some of the things in my presentation have that bright little red asterisk, I guess you'd call it, next to it. And the reason I put that in there when I was updating the program is because the things that have that little asterisk are things that are directly related to the tragedy in Florida that are included within the public policy statement, the public policies that CAI has developed. So if you would have seen this presentation 6 months ago or a year ago, it would not have talked about the establishment of practice and procedures for maintaining property values and building safety in the future. But that's directly a result of the tragedy in Florida, which has resulted in some very proactive and good things for communities going forward. So what are the phases of the transition process? The first is document development. So what do we mean by document development? It's the legal creation of the community. It hasn't been built yet. It's when the developer or the builder are sitting there and say, I want to build a community. And it's the legal creation of the community association, which typically includes the master deed, the bylaws, the proposed budget, and also is the development of the design drawings and the maintenance manual are prepared. So that's the document development. And the reason you see the red asterisk there is because the did I say maintenance? Oh, I spelled maintenance wrong. That's what happens when you work on this late at night. But that should say maintenance, not maintenance. But the public policy, as well as the New Jersey bill that's out there, requires the developer not only to put together a reserve study as part of the governing documents, but also a maintenance manual as part of the original documents, which I'll touch on again as I go through the presentation. But that's why you see that asterisk there. So that's phase 1. Now let's go to phase 2. Everybody knows what phase 2 is. It's construction. It's when the building of the communities occur, including ongoing inspections regarding the structural system. Again, you see a red asterisk there because now there's going to be some very specific requirements in terms of inspecting the structural system of the buildings as they're being built. Don't get me wrong, most builders do inspections during construction. There's building officials that come out and all kinds of things. But these type of inspections I'm going to touch on for the builder during construction are directly related to the structural system and the safety of the buildings going forward. That's why you see that red asterisk. Construction, as you all understand, is absolutely critical because typically the problems you see as part of the transition problems when we talk about problems has to do with construction. Maybe being built wrong, maybe these type of things, which I'm going to touch on. So phase 2 is construction. Phase 3 is turnover. Now, a lot of people look at transition process and they don't transition and don't realize that it's a process. And a lot of people don't understand the term turnover. Turnover is a point in time. Transition is a process. So turnover typically occurs when 75% of the homes have been sold, which at that point, the new homeowners take control of the community. So depending on your bylaws and your governing documents, board members start to populate the board of the community as the units are sold. But the turnover point in time when they take control of the community is generally at 75% of the units being sold. That doesn't mean there may not be still be builder representative on the board, but at that point in time, the homeowners then take control. So you'd see that it's not at 50%, it's at 75%, and that's generally the process across the country. So turnover is a critical time because that's the point in time when you get control, the board members get control, and you start implementing things like I'm going to talk about as far as this presentation, where prior to that, you don't have the control to do it. Although I will say some of the things I'm going to talk about, there are builders out there that have allowed their communities and worked with their communities to do some of the things I'm talking about. It's maybe because it's an extended sellout of the community, it's a large community or other things. But that's phase 3 is the turnover. So what's phase 4? Phase 4 is, as you would expect, it's now the builder is gone, and it's the time when the homeowners have taken control of the community, and it's become an independent community. So like I said, phase 3, the turnover is at 75%. Phase 4 is when the homeowners are 100% in control of the community, and it's all theirs. So it's kind of misuse of words because it says have taken control, but they actually take control of 75%. But at the independent community, they're totally independent, which means they have 100% of the board, and I guess, and I would assume 100% of the units are sold. So let's talk about some of the key concepts. All right, this is absolutely critical for everything having to do with community associations. What is a common and a limited common element? And that it is an absolute critical key concept to understand, and it's how they delineate the areas of responsibility for the association and establish the risk areas for the developer. So, for example, a common element is something that the community as a whole underneath their board of directors is responsible for. Something that's not a common element, that is just for the unit owner, is something that the unit owner is responsible for, and not the board and development. So the reason why it becomes important for the association and a risk for the developer is that for the association, this is what they're going to take over. They're going to take control of it. For the developer, it's a risk because when the community goes back to the developer and says, for example, we want you to fix something, the developer is responsible for the construction of the common elements relating directly to the board as opposed to relating to the homeowners. Something I don't touch on in this presentation, but I'll mention, is that for the homeowners, at least in the state of New Jersey, there's a requirement that the builder provide them with a homeowner's warranty policy. And that homeowner's warranty policy covers what they're responsible for and is not part of the common elements typically. So there's 2 types of common elements. The general common elements, it's for the use of all the owners and replaced and maintained by the association. And I'll talk about the different types of associations, different types of common elements in a second, but keep in mind it's the general common elements are for the use of all of the owners, and it's replaced and maintained by the association, as opposed to the limited common elements. The limited common elements are for the exclusive use of one or more individual owners, but they're typically replaced and possibly maintained by the association. A typical example, which is shown in this picture above, is a balcony. A balcony on a unit is for the exclusive use of the person that lives in that unit, but in many, many instances, the responsibility for maintaining and replacing that balcony falls on the association because it is a limited common element. So that's the difference between the common element and the limited common element. Another limited common element may be the attics in your home, where the board, maybe the association is responsible for the attic, but the homeowner has exclusive use to that attic. So, but the critical point in anything you do with this, any type of community association, has to do with what are the common elements, because they define who's responsible for what. You'll also notice that I use the word community association because a lot of people use the term condominium for everything. Condominium is a type of community association, and the term community association deals with all of the types of associations, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Keep in mind that if you look at the industry right now, there are, up until a few months ago at least, the construction was out of control. The cost of homes and everything was very high. And there's a very large demand for residential housing and community associations, which is still going on. So if you look at the total population of residential homes in this country, about 26% of all the residential homes in this country are made up of some type of community association. But of all the new homes being built, 80% of them are being built as a community association. And I'd actually make the argument in this part of the country, now probably closer to 100% of all new residential homes are being built as part of a community association. But so if 26% of the residential homes are made up of associations, but 80% of new homes are community associations, what that clearly showing is that it's a growing industry where that 26% of all is going to become 30%, it's going to become 40%, because most homes are being built as an association. Currently in the United States, there are approximately 355,000 community associations. When this industry first took off in this country, I think it was in the 1970s, there were probably about 5 or 6 or 7,000 associations, but now there's 355,000 approximately. If you're interested in the demographics of this by state, how many there are, CAI has a great publication called the Fact Book. If you go to their national website, caionline.org, and do a search for the Fact Book, it will give you information in terms of demographics of community associations in every state as well as across the country, which is where I get these numbers from. And a good friend of mine actually writes the Fact Book. Some of you may know his name is Cliff Treese, but some great source of information.
Mitch, there's a question about sidewalks. Are they common or limited?
Good question about sidewalks. It depends. I'll probably answer that question right now because it depends on the type of association. For example, I'm going to mention 2 different types of associations, the primary types. The first is a condominium. And basically what a condominium association means is that the board and the common elements are comprised of the site, including the sidewalk and the buildings. But keep in mind, in some places, those sidewalks may be the responsibility of the town because they don't fall on community property, and the town may be responsible for them. But in many, many instances, if you have a condominium development, which includes site and buildings, let's say a townhouse community that has 50 buildings or something with sidewalks going up and down the roads, those sidewalks are the responsibility of the association. But I will put an asterisk on there, not a red one, but you do need to check your governing documents for the description of the common elements. Most people, the governing documents are a book that you get. Some other people refer to it as a public offering statement. And sometimes it's not written in layman's terms, but if you go into that book, which you all got when you purchased your unit, it has a description and a definition of the common element. So most cases of a condo in a townhouse type community or any type of community, those sidewalks are the responsibility of the association. Now let's talk about a homeowners association. Homeowners association is an association where the buildings are the responsibility and owned by the unit owner, and they are not, and the common elements only incorporate the site itself, the site, the roads, the sidewalks, the common areas around the buildings. If there's a clubhouse, that's part of the common elements, or if there's amenities such as tennis courts and these type of things, then those fall under the common elements of a homeowners association, but the buildings do not. That doesn't mean to say that if you have a condominium community that has these amenities, they're not part of the common elements. They are, but the difference primarily is that in a homeowners association, the buildings are excluded from the common elements. And I have to say there's all kinds of variations on these themes, but the primary ones that we're talking about are condos, homeowners associations. And you'll see that because condos are generally attached units in buildings, 50 to 55% of all associations, but 75% of the units are condos. But in a homeowners association, it's only 20% of the units because it might be individual single family homes, which are the responsibility of the homeowner, but the site around them, like the sidewalks and the roads and those things, are the responsibility of the association, which are the common elements. There's a number of different terms that are used for these things. Condo is pretty straightforward, used across the country. But when you get to the term homeowners association, there are many different terms that define the same thing, like a planned unit development and things like that. But the concept is generally the same. But it's critical to take a look at the governing documents to describe for your community specifically what are the common elements, because those are the things that you're responsible for when it comes to the transition process and you're taking control of them from the developer. A lot of communities now have mixed use, where it's a combination of not just residential, but there may be stores and maybe all kinds of things that make it a mixed use community. So, but the key concept again is the type of common elements.
Mitch, another question about co-op.
Oh, co-op. Very few, you see a lot of co-ops in New York. Not many co-ops are being built these days. A co-op really is not, it's a corporation that owns everything, and you're buying into a corporation as opposed to buying and becoming what's called a fee simple owner. So that's what a co-op is. Very rare. I don't remember any co-ops being built in New Jersey in a long time. As a matter of fact, in Manhattan, where you see a lot of co-ops, historically, most of the things being built in Manhattan these days are condos, not co-ops. So it would fall under that list of community associations, but I don't even mention it because there's so few of them. Next key concept is reserve study. Reserve study is a budget planning tool that establishes a funding plan to pay for the replacement of the common elements, essentially. So in the budget, a critical part of the budget is if you have, let's say, a condo development and the roofs are included or the sidewalks are included in a homeowners association, whatever make up the common elements, how much money do you need to set aside each year? So when it comes time to repave the roads or replace that roof, you have enough money in that fund to do it. That's what a reserve study does. There's a few different types of reserve studies. And one at the top is when you develop a community as part of those governing documents that I talked about, there's what's known as a preliminary study being done. What's missing when you do a preliminary study? What's missing is that the community has not been built yet, so you can't see it. So preliminary study is based on looking at the design drawings, the architectural plans, and the engineering plans, and developing a reserve study based on what it shows there for the roofs, what it shows there for the roads, what's defined as the common elements, and that goes into the governing documents as part of the budget. You know, how much should be set aside for this? One of the things that you'll see in the new bill in New Jersey, as well as I should have put a little red asterisk down next to that, is that the public policy requires that when construction is complete, that preliminary study be updated by the developer to reflect the as-built community as opposed to what the plans show. Now, don't get nervous that somebody's building something wrong because it doesn't match the plans. You're never going to build something to exactly match the plans. There are changes that take place during construction. I'm not saying it's bad that that happens, but the reserve study at the end of construction should be updated to reflect what was actually built rather than what's done on the drawings. So that's part of developing the governing documents. But again, like I mentioned, public policy is that it should be updated at the end of construction. The next reserve study type is done during turnover. And this is what I had talked about before. It could be an update that's being done of the one from the governing documents. In many instances, as part of the transition process, which I'll talk about in a few seconds, the community will have their transition engineer put together a reserve study going forward, as well as looking backwards to see if the one that was included in the governing documents was adequate, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Then after turnover, the public policy says that reserve studies should be updated at a maximum of every 5 years. The best practices in the industry is that the reserve study should be updated every 3 years. And there's a number of different variables, but just as rule of thumb, there should be updates done of reserve studies because they don't have to be totally redone, but the conditions change, the replacement costs change, and different things change. So it's absolutely a requirement that the reserve study be updated on an ongoing basis. And if I'm not mistaken, the bill in New Jersey says that communities will be required to update the reserve study a maximum of every 5 years. And it also says who should update it, what the qualifications are of the person who does the update. The other thing I'll mention is going back to the governing documents and the preliminary study. New Jersey, for many, many years in the regulatory requirements said that the developer needs to include an adequate funding, an adequate reserve study, or a reserve study that provides adequate funding. There were a lot of problems over that. And about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a committee between CAI, the builders, and the Department of Community Affairs in New Jersey, which I was on. And the law has been changed now by where it now defines in the statutory requirements what adequacy means, what should be included in this preliminary study in the governing documents, when it should be updated, things like that. So that just happened in New Jersey a couple of years ago because the way it was defined prior to that by just using the word adequate, it evolved into a lot of problems as part of the transition process. So if anybody would like to see a copy of the current law in New Jersey in regards to what a preliminary study is, who should do it, and all these kind of things, I'd be happy to share it. And I'll touch on that again when I get into a little more into the transition. So now another key concept is maintenance. Maintenance has been added to this presentation because of the public policy, and it's the process of preserving something. 3 different types of maintenance: preventive maintenance, which is maintenance that's applied essentially to be done in a planned fashion to the components on the reserve study. So for example, if you say something will have a 20-year life, how do you need to maintain it so it will get to that 20-year life? That's preventive maintenance. Reason I've included in here with the asterisks is that the developers are now going to be required as part of their governing documents to do what's called a maintenance manual. That maintenance manual will include a preventive maintenance schedule in it, along with the cost that should be set aside to maintain the common elements that are included in the reserve study. Part of transition, clearly. Next is corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance means that as a building ages, you run into problems. So not because it was built wrong, but just because it's getting older. So corrective maintenance means that when you do periodic inspections during the life of your community, whether it's part of a reserve study or other things, which I'll touch on, you might find a problem and then you have to fix it, which is called corrective maintenance, following the detection of a problem. Deferred maintenance is the fallback for a lot of people, and it essentially means you don't maintain it, you just postpone maintenance. So deferred maintenance means, in my mind, you know you should have preventive maintenance and you don't do it, which then leads to a lot more corrective maintenance. So I'm going to touch on that in a few seconds when it comes to life cycle costs. But the reason I've added this is because of the public policy. Another thing added public policy is inspections during construction by the developer, which, as you know, when the developer is building the community, that is part of the transition process. But the public policy and the bill in New Jersey requires that the developer does structural reviews of the existing structure during construction to make sure it's being built to match the design drawings. And if you find that it's not being built to match the design drawings, the developer is going to need to have it reviewed and a letter of certification issued by a licensed engineer saying that any changes to the structure are adequate and it still structurally meets the structural requirements of the original design. Keep in mind, and I think I have it in somewhere, this does not take the place of a transition study for a community, which I'm going to talk about. This is to look at the structure. And the public policy says, and I'm pretty sure the bill in New Jersey says, that if there are changes and there's no letter received that's saying that it's adequate at the end of construction, you will not be able to get a certificate of occupancy for that building. Baseline inspection, now the community's taken over, and the baseline inspection is to look at the community within the first 2 years of construction, within the first 5 years of construction, or for older buildings within 2 years of the enactment of the law, to come up with a baseline of the conditions of the structural system of the buildings so that it can be measured against in the future for any progressive deterioration as the building ages. Again, this is not a transition study, but there's at least one management company I can think about there that's very proactive, where although it's not part of a transition study in the past, they're asking to have a baseline inspection done of some of their buildings as part of the transition process, because the engineer is going to be out there looking at it anyway. So that's a baseline inspection. The other thing is ongoing inspections. It essentially says that, which is not part of transitions later on, but for buildings up to 20 years old, they have to have one of these periodic inspections done a maximum of every 10 years. And once a building is over 20 years old, it's a maximum of every 5 years. So, but where this fits into transition is, I mentioned that the developer is going to be required to include a maintenance manual in their governing documents. That maintenance manual, in addition to preventive maintenance of the cost, is going to be required to say in there, this is the cost of doing these periodic inspections as part of the budget. And the community will start budgeting for these periodic inspections based on the governing documents that the developer prepares. So it's going to be built into the budget by the developer, these inspections. So there's a number of changes that are taking place to maintain the safety of your community. Now, the other thing keep in mind, which is key, is that a lot of people think that the tragedy in Florida took place because it was a high-rise building. We came to the conclusion very quickly that it's not the height of the building that determines whether it's structurally sound or not. It's the material it's made out of. So just going quickly through this, that the public policy and the state of New Jersey say that these periodic inspections and everything I'm talking about are for multifamily residential buildings of concrete, load-bearing masonry, steel, or hybrid structural systems, such as heavy timber, including podium decks. That's all I'm going to say, but it's not based on the height of the building. So don't ever fool yourself into thinking that the only time you'll ever have a structural problem is with a high-rise building. All right, periodic inspections. Oh, this slide's in here twice, so let's ignore this one. All right, key concepts. Now we're going where the transition process. The developer has a number of engineers that works for the developer. The developer's engineers get involved in designing the community, reviewing the documents. And when I say that, and reviewing the documents means that they're looking at the governing documents to make sure the description of the community matches the design. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done by the engineer, but in some instances, the developer's engineer will review the documents. The developer's engineer will also prepare the budgetary items. It may be an engineer, it might be the reserve specialist, it might be somebody else, but the budgetary items may be preparation of the reserve study, preparation of the preventive maintenance schedule, but these are some of the things that the developer's engineer, it's not always one engineer because there's different specialties, but the developer's engineers will do to include in the governing documents. The other thing the developer engineer will do, based on, you see the red asterisk, is the structural inspections during construction, as well as the preparation of the maintenance manuals that go in the governing documents. And there are, in addition to these structural inspections, there are a number of developers that actually hire inspectors to do third-party inspections during construction, not only to look at the structure, but to look at the overall construction. So to hopefully keep them out of trouble when they get into transition, because everything then is going to be built perfectly. Now let's talk about the associations engineer. The associations engineer generally gets involved in the preparation of a transition study. The transition study is essentially home inspection. The goal is to assure that general conformance with the plans and specifications, if it's a new community, and if it's a conversion. I don't know if anybody out here is working with a conversion. I think probably most people are dealing with new communities. But for a new community, it's to do a review of the community to see if it was prepared, built in conformance with the design drawings, good workmanship, and all these types of things, which I'll get into in a second. And to assure, but if it's not a new community, it's a conversion where it's not based on design drawings and it's just a description in the disclosure documents, then the engineer is doing a transition study based on what the documents say should have been built rather than drawings. It's a little sidelight. Most communities these days are new and not conversions. The other thing the association's engineer, as I talked about before, will do is prepare a reserve study. How much should be set aside and to confirm adequacy of the initial budget? And I spoke about that a second ago. The association's engineer will also prepare and update the maintenance manual. I will tell you that when we get requests for transition studies, and there's a lot of them these days, as you can imagine, I'm telling by the audience we have, it's very rare that we get an RFP requesting specifically what the association or the manager wants in the as part of the transition study. There's one management company I can think of in particular that always asks as part of their transition study, not only to look at things and do a reserve study, but also to do a preventive maintenance schedule for the community. That's going forward, or that's going back, but that's what they're asking for. You're going to find that that's going to change because now the requirements are probably going to change in the fall, that it's going to require the developer to do this maintenance manual. And then as part of the transition study, the engineer will update it, maybe not recreate one. So the association's engineer is to prepare and update the maintenance manual and also reserve study adequacy. Looking back to see if the developer's reserve study was adequate. Now, let me explain to you there's a lot of confusion in the industry that people don't understand what adequate reserves mean. As you can tell, I've been pretty involved with reserve studies, and we came up, the definition of adequacy for a reserve study means that if you take a cash flow projection of your reserve study going out a cash flow period of generally 30 years, and it does not drop into a deficit position anytime within that 30-year period, that's adequate funding, because that means that you have enough money to replace any of the components when it comes time to replacing. In a couple of weeks, I think I'm giving a presentation on reserve studies, not transition, and you'll see that that type of funding does have the most risk, but that's the definition of adequacy. It's essentially, for those of you who know the terminology, it's baseline funding, which is much too risky, but that's the definition of adequacy. All right, now what does the transition study identify? I think somebody's maybe should mute themselves. What does the transition study identify? It identifies areas that fall out of compliance with various standards. the architectural and engineering plans, specifications, governing documents, good workmanship, and manufacturer standards. So that's what's being measured against. So what are the standards? Approved design drawings. These are the design drawings that the construction of the community was based on. So what you do as part of a transition study is you take a look at the drawings as they relate to the common elements, take a look at what was built, and compare the two to make sure they are in general conformance with each other. One of the misconceptions I see a lot of times is that people think that it doesn't match the design drawings, it's a defect. I've seen a lot of times that a developer will do something different from the design drawings that's actually better. So you really need, when you're doing this transition study, if there is a difference between the two, to also identify whether it's equivalent or better, because just because it's different doesn't mean it's bad. The other standard is building codes and statutory requirements. People are under the impression a lot of times that when you're doing a transition study, the transition engineer will review the entire design to make sure that it matches the building codes. That is not done. These design plans, the architectural and engineering plans, are done by licensed architects and engineers, and they're reviewed by the municipal authorities. It's their role to make sure that the design meets the code requirements. But if part of the transition study, we identify something that does not match the drawings, then at that time, a review should be done to see if it still matches the code. But keep in mind that a transition study is not intended to do a code review of an entire design of the community. The other thing is statutory requirements. I threw statutory requirements in here just for this presentation, as a matter of fact, because there are more and more statutory requirements that require the developer to do certain things that establish the standards. Like I talked about the preliminary reserve study that's done as part of the governing documents, the maintenance manual and other things, those set the standards for reviewing when you're doing a transition study. Performance standards. And you'll see performance standards, I say under here, regulations governing new home warranties and builder's registration. In the state of New Jersey, when you buy a new home, you're required to be given a homeowner's warranty policy. Now, this is a performance standard. It doesn't say how it should be built, like the building code may say, but it says how it should perform. A perfect example is a building should not leak. That's a performance standard. If it leaks, it's not in conformance with these performance standards. So these are some of the other things we review against. The other common one is people always think they have drainage problems, that there's standing water in the grass outside their home. So they go out, you just had a heavy rainstorm, they go outside, there's a puddle. So that it's built wrong because there's water standing there. The performance standard for drainage is that water should drain from around the home within 24 hours after a rainstorm. Now, if you go out there and you're looking, there's water standing 2 days after a rainstorm, it may not meet those performance standards, but these standards are something that that set a performance of something, not necessarily how it's going to be built. Manufacturer's literature. What does the manufacturer say about the way things should be installed? And another standard would be the National Reserve Study standards, which identify what adequacy is of reserve funding. So these are the standards. Some additional services that come up as part of a transition study, which are generally not included as part of the base contract. If somebody gives you a proposal to do a transition study, that's not the end of the cost of doing a study. There are also always additional things that happen. So if anybody tells you, here's the cost of the transition study, and then you're done with us as far as fees, they're not telling you the truth. If people ask me that, I say it depends on a lot of things, what they find, what the developer's reaction is to the study and things like that. But things that can happen as additional services include preparation of the cost estimate, which I'll touch on again in a few seconds. But if we find deficiencies, how much is it going to cost to fix? Is it going to cost $10,000 to fix or $100,000 to sue the developer to fix it? I mean, you need to make business decisions sometimes based on cost estimates. Remedial designs, how do you fix it? Invasive testing, which I'm going to show you some examples in a second. If a water is leaking into a clubhouse, how do you know where it's coming from? But just looking at it, if you don't do something else such as invasive testing or moisture probes or thermographic evaluation, which I'll show you in a second, that will tell you what's going on and where the water is coming from. Meetings and walkthroughs. Typically, a transition study says we include X number of meetings. And in your RFP, when you ask for a proposal from an engineer, make sure how many meetings are included in there, or else they're just going to give you 1 or 2 meetings. So how many meetings? And additional meetings generally run into more money, and typically there are additional meetings that are necessary. And then if worse comes to worse, to provide litigation or ADR, alternative dispute resolution support. You do not want to end up in litigation. The worst place for you to go is litigation, which I'll talk on it about in a second. But the only people that make that money during litigation are me, the engineer, and your attorney. But these are some of the additional services that happen with the transition study. The other thing that's interesting about community associations is the interrelationship between the parts. For example, starting at the top, you have the governing documents. The governing documents define what the common elements are. The common elements define what the maintenance and reserve requirements are, and the maintenance and reserve requirements define what goes into the budget. So there's so many interconnections going on here that it's really important that you deal with consultants and boards and managers that understand the relationships between them. Another common thing that comes up is that when you do a transition study, there may be a maintenance problem, and you'll say that there's something wrong here, and we'll say it's just a maintenance problem, and they'll say, well, the developer was responsible for maintenance. So there's all kinds of variables that go on based on these connections that you need to understand as part of the transition process. So another key concept is consequential damages. It's damage to one part of the building due to a deficiency in another. What you're looking at, thankfully, is not too common, but in these cases, you're seeing where the building exterior facade was constructed wrong, and it led to consequential damages to what was underneath it. So consequential damages, and I'm not going to be an attorney, although I've listened to many of them, is what opens up the door a lot of times to insurance money, because you're covered, the builder may be covered for consequential damages. But I just wanted to point this out because it ties the damage to the root cause, which in most cases involves water infiltration that damages what's behind the building facades. Some of the risks: deficient construction or an inadequate budget. That's primarily what people are looking for when they're doing a transition study, to find out if there's deficient construction or inadequate budget. The best thing that can happen is that you pay an engineer to do a study and you don't have any. These things don't exist. So why are the risks so high? I'm sure many people, well, homeowners' expectations is very important. A lack of education, poor construction, poor document development. I mean, these are the things why the risks are so high. But the other thing is that a lot of people, when they buy a single family home that is not as part of a community association, what do? You go, you look at the home, you pick out the home you like, you have a home inspector come out to inspect it, you may find something wrong, and then you go back to the person who's selling it and say, I want to buy the house, but take $5 off of it because I have to fix something. And that's, you negotiate these kind of things before you buy it. In a community association, totally different. You actually buy the home, then you do the inspection. And because you can't inspect the common elements until the turnover point at 75% control. So now you're looking at it. What does that lead to? Homeowners' expectation that everything is built perfect and there's nothing wrong. That's impossible. The homeowners' expectations you have to realize that there are going to be some things that need to be corrected. Hopefully they're just small punch list type items that a developer will come back and fix. It's part of the process, but you really have to make sure that the homeowners' expectations, not necessarily the ones on the board, but the people that live there, understand exactly what the process is and what their expectations should be. Most times when we do a transition study, we offer to the community to do a seminar like this by Zoom. We've done this for hundreds of people in communities, a seminar to educate people in terms of what they've bought and to help set their expectations. The common one is the drainage. It's not a drainage problem if there's a puddle after it starts raining. So I think it's very important to educate. The next step is lack of education, is to educate the new homeowners in terms of what they bought and what their expectations should be. And I have to tell you that I've seen some builders who they take so much pride in what they built that no matter what anybody says to them, they'll say you're wrong, even though they feel that they built it perfect. It may be a beautiful community, but I think that in some cases is from a lack of education to them sometimes of what the transition process is, as well as forgetting about the homeowners' expectations, but maybe the builders' expectations of what people should do when they go get one of their communities. No question that you have poor construction or poor document development. It's not as widespread as you think, but it does happen. So, and then the question is, what does poor construction really mean? Is it punch list or is it major defect? Deficient construction, just to show you a couple of examples of what is meant by that. On the left-hand side, showing the left-hand side, it's inadequate detailing of critical areas. What I mean here is that these are beams that were supporting the second story of about 100 units. The person who was building it left out one little piece of flashing where that wall comes down onto the beam. So what happened is the water would flow down, it would get in and rot out the beam. It cost $1 million to fix this, a lot of money. So don't think that the developer did this to save money. That flashing that should have been in there would have cost $10 to study. But that type of thing happens if you're not watching it and understanding exactly how a building works. Next one on the bottom, as-built construction does not match design drawings. Here you have an inlet that should be on the road next to a curb, but it was put in the middle of a field. Stupid mistake, what can I tell you? Then the top one there is as-built construction does not match design drawings. Here the developer tried to be a good person, and they said at the back of these homes, there's a slope down into the woods, and it's beautiful, but the backyard isn't usable because there's such a slope there. So what they did is they put in a retaining wall to make all the homeowners happy. So now what happens as part of the transition process? The wall isn't shown on the drawings. It should have been there. The wall is not reserved for as part of the governing document reserve study because it wasn't shown on the plans. And it's not safe because if a little kid's playing in the backyard, they can fall off the top of the wall. So what it goes to prove is sometimes no good deed goes unpunished, but that's an example. It doesn't match your drawings, but it has impacts on a number of other things. Bottom right, another common problem you see in buildings, gutters and downspouts. The gutters, if you look at this building, you see here, you've got upper roofs that are very large that have gutters and downspouts that then dump the water onto a lower roof right above the entrance that brings all that water into one downspout that goes down to the ground, which first of all, doesn't have the capacity to take all the water from the upper roof, but at the same time, where is it dumping that water? Right across the sidewalks. When you have snow melt on that roof in the winter, it's going to come out of that downspout right there and cause an icing condition. So unclear detail. I have seen over the years that more and more architects now add the exact location where the downspouts and gutters should go because it's a common kind of crazy deficiency that can become a safety issue because of locations of downspouts and gutters. Now let's talk about poor workmanship. Poor workmanship is very hard to measure because you're measuring it against not a real standard other than a subjective standard of what's the condition of it after it's built. But poor workmanship is something that's identified in the studies. Now, improper installed flashing. Flashing is something that keeps the water out of the building and pushing it to the outside. Flashing is key. There's one, without going into a lot of detail, one of the most common deficiencies I've seen is that what's called kick-out flashing is not installed in the building, which causes a lot of damage. And it's because nobody's watching it and the people that are building it don't understand how flashing works and where it should go. Let's see, the upper left, you're looking at a catch basin where the water should be coming out of that pipe you see, but instead it's coming out of the wall in the catch basin because it wasn't constructed right. Then the bottom right-hand corner, not uncommon, you have buildings that are very close to each other and the grading in between the buildings isn't enough for the water to flow out after a rainstorm. And on top of that, you're dumping a huge amount of water into that space from the downspouts from the roof. So there's all kinds of things that can happen. But here's a couple of techniques that are used to evaluate things. For example, the top picture is showing roofing issues. And in this, we use it exclusively now where we take drone photography, where we'll drone an entire community. And by doing that, we can take a look at what it looks like looking down to see things without walking roofs. And it saves not only a lot of time, but it's much more accurate and detailed than if you're walking a community. So for most transition studies these days, to identify roofing issues and other things, we use drone technology. The middle one, the use of hard to install materials. I would say you'd be surprised, but you probably wouldn't be surprised at how many materials are specified to be used, but are not easy to install. And unless you're watching the contractors every minute with somebody who knows how it should be installed, it may be installed improperly. Bottom picture is showing a place where there was an upper deck where water got through because the flashing wasn't right. And you can see the damage to the sheathing above the sliding glass door on the first floor. So the question used to become, how much invasive testing do we do? We have 500 units. We found this in one unit. What do we do now? Now, some of the new technologies, which the top one again is drone technology, we also use this middle one extensively, infrared technology, where we can take a picture of the building and based on the temperature difference between certain parts of the buildings and other parts, it identifies where water is without taking the buildings apart. We use this extensively. Up until a couple of years ago, what had to happen was you would take apart every one of these areas in the bottom right-hand corner to find out where the water is and if it was built wrong. And now we just take a picture of it and we can see and narrow down where the problems are. For example, the picture you see in the middle, very, very common. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but what happens is the water flows down, the flashing in this spot is no good. The water gets behind the stone, builds up and starts rotting out the building. But you see the brightness? That means there's much higher temperature there, which means that there's water there because the water holds the heat. So there's so much great technology out there that can help narrow down where the problems are and significantly reduce the cost of finding it. All right, now let's talk about for a second about inadequate reserves, which is another part of the transition process sometimes. Inadequate reserves a lot of times are based on the quantities, don't match the drawings, unit costs or developer costs. I talked about this before. The reserve studies prepared prior to the completion of the design drawings. Not even the drawings aren't even done yet, but they want to get in the application for approval. It's not updated completion of construction. Studies prepared by unqualified individual. And the last one I added, the lack of knowledge of statutory requirements, because in New Jersey, if you follow the statutory requirements for putting together a reserve study for the governing documents, it's very rare that I think you're going to run into inadequate reserves because it's very clearly defined what needs to be included and what the definition of adequacy is. So at least in the state of New Jersey, we're going in a good direction. I've seen in the past that many, many times as part of the transition process, there's a claim made in regards to inadequate reserves when nobody who makes the claim even understands the definition of what adequacy means. So that's changing. What are the expectations? In a perfect world, the studies will show that no construction deficiencies, no budgetary deficiencies, everything was built perfectly. Doesn't happen. The question is, what kind of deficiencies do you have? So again, you have to set expectations, and there's no such thing as perfect construction. Didn't build it wrong on purpose. And if the process is guided in a non-confrontational way, it will most likely stay non-confrontational. Remember, it's not uncommon for minor deficiencies to exist. However, and I hate to say it, but I'm going to go a few minutes over because I got a few more slides for you. If you have to leave, your door's locked, you can't go. So setting expectations, where the problems do exist, they should report it objectively. Let me give you an example. You have 500 units, you inspect 10 windows, one of them has a leak. So the community says, okay, that means 10% of the windows have a leak, not 1 out of 1,000. You really have to report this objectively and not extrapolate problems, assuming it's everywhere, because it really screws up the expectations and people think the developer made a big mistake and everything's built wrong when it's only 1 window out of 1,000, not 10% of them. So it has to be very objective. Claims evaluation, typical way claims are resolved are correction of the problems, cash contribution. Let's say there's a problem with the sidewalks. The developer will say, because instead of lasting 30 years, they're going to last 20, we'll make a contribution to the reserve schedule, or we'll give you money, you go fix it, you're right, it's wrong. Most developers, I think, would prefer that because then they can't, then they're not responsible for it anymore, then it's the association. Don't be afraid to let the developer come back and fix things rather than give you money, because as soon as they give you money, then you own it if there's a problem. If the developer fixes, just because they did it wrong once doesn't mean they're going to do it wrong again. Don't believe that. It's not true. So don't be afraid to let a developer come back and fix things. What should a transition study include to make sure that it's objective? And if you were going to a firm like mine for a reserve study, a transition study proposal, I would use this slide. Here's what I want. I want a list of all the deficiencies. And for each deficiency, I wanted to identify what the standard is that you're saying it doesn't match. So does it not match the design drawings? Does it not match the code? All the kind of things. But every deficiency should say the location and what the standard it is, because then the developer can look at the list and say, I agree and I'll fix it. I don't agree, whatever the reason is. I couldn't find it or it's equivalent. So this is something that's very important in order to keep your study objective. The claim evaluation, there are some strong claims and weak claims. A strong claim can be deviation from design drawings if it's not equivalent, deviation from the code if it's a safety issue, results in water or other damage. A weak claim is that it's deviation, but it's equivalent. But I'll also say drainage. If you have a puddle sitting there 25 hours after a rainstorm and the standard says 24 hours, it's a weak claim. The puddle's going to dry up. It may exceed the standard, but what's the damage? And it's so insignificant. So be very careful they don't get drawn into these things. Claim evaluation. I just want to show you what happened in the community we were working at. We did a transition study for a community and found some problems. Cost estimate. My recommendation is don't do a cost estimate until after you receive a response to your report, because the developer comes back and says they're going to fix everything. You don't need a cost estimate. As soon as you do a cost estimate, it will set unrealistic expectations and deal with business decisions, as I talked about before. For litigation, be prepared. You need all kinds of things in order to litigate things. You got to be very detailed of exactly what the problem is and proving it what the standard is. The transition team typically consists of 5 members: the sponsor, the property manager, the attorney, accountant, engineer. Now, I'm giving a theoretical answer to this, but generally it's just the property manager, the attorney, accountant, and the engineer. In some cases, we've been involved where the developer says, we will pay for your transition study if you use certain engineers because we know they'll be objective. Don't be afraid to take them up on that. Sometimes they use that study to go back against some of their subcontractors to fix things. What are the dangers? This is a real life scenario. It's a $9 million construction claim. The association files a suit against, don't worry, I just have 4 slides left. The association files a suit against the developer. Developer retains legal counsel and expert. The expert report agrees with the claim, but not the costs. The developer then brings in 25 subcontractors. All the subcontractors report the claim to the insurance company. Each retains an attorney, and on behalf of the subcontractor, each subcontractor then retains an expert. The association spends $1.5 million on legal expense, $1.5 million on association, $3 million total association expense for a $9 million claim. But now add this together. The developer cost is expert $500, legal $1 million, third-party expenses for depositions $4 million, total defense costs $5.5 million. So you see where I'm going on this. So the association spent $3.5 million, developers spent $5.5 million, and all the subcontractors for a total of $8.5 million to settle a $9 million claim. So be very careful. I have to say there's got to be a better way. But cutting edge association strategies, negotiation, mediation. The second one I think more and more people should consider, and that's third-party review of reports. For example, if you get a transition study says there's $1 million worth of damage, before you jump to the next step, have another engineer review that report to see if they agree with what it says. It's called a peer review. Most engineers should not have a problem if you do a third-party review of a report, but if it's millions of dollars worth of claim damages, it's worth it to do that. Other things, education I talked about, communication, evaluation of claims for strength, establish a community transition committee of rational people. I think there's such thing in that, but you don't want people, a lot of times you get the transition committee or the people who are upset because the developer didn't return a phone call or something like that, but you need a transition committee of rational people. Think about what is going on with the business view and don't take it personal. Developer cutting edge strategies, negotiation, mediation, expert preparation of budgets, third-party observations during construction, education, communication, and the better developers when it comes to transition, encourage a team of professionals with the goal of collaboration. So their goal is fix what they need to fix, get out of there and make some money and let everybody there be salespeople for what they're selling. Again, mentioned the RFP for transition study. If you're looking for a transition study, the study must include the locations, the standards. If it's a deviation from the drawings, it's the equivalent. Is it workmanship? Is the code? Is it equivalency? But it has to include the locations and what the standard is, or else the developer isn't going to review it. I got this. Oh, you're lucky. Out of 4 slides, I have this one in here twice. All right, so a little extra. This is my last slide. I'm pretty much hit it with transition, but I just want to mention that Fannie and Freddie have come out with new requirements based on the problem in Florida, where they now have addendums to their forms and special forms that you need to fill out to confirm that there's no structural problems in your communities, as well as that you're adequately funding reserves. So these standards relate to condos and co-ops with 5 or more units and attached buildings. So if you have 5 units and 2 of them are attached and the other 3 are not, you have to fill out this form. If you have 500 units and all of them are single family, but you have 1 building with 5 attached, you have to fill out the form. You have to be very careful when you fill out the form. I will tell you that I've had conversations through CAI with both the people at Fannie and Freddie. They are in the process of revising these forms to be much more user-friendly, and they're making some changes in regards to reserve requirements, a number of things. So you are going to see changes, but right now we have to live with this. And if anybody has any questions about how to fill it out, because some of the questions are not very clear, please feel free to give me a call. So now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm done. And we still have a pretty good crew here. So if anybody wants to jump in and get rid of your mute and ask me any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. What we will send you, like I said, is we'll send you all a copy of the attachments I referenced. So, so anybody have any questions about anything, or did I answer every single question you have? Trish.
Trish, yeah.
You're muting yourself, or you're muted.
Okay. There you go. So when we did the initial form for the Fannie Freddie, we're going to have to redo the form again.
The way it's set up is that you're sending in this form. There's a form with an addendum for Fannie. The form that you send out in the past had to be sent in every year and updated. They are requiring that this addendum be updated every year, yes. But keep in mind, the first question on that form is, when is the last time you had an engineer or somebody inspect your community? That does not mean you have to have an engineer or an engineer inspect your community. The answer to that question should be, if you didn't have, or the question should be, if you haven't had an engineer or somebody inspect this, provide the following information, such as board meeting minutes and these kind of things, to show that there's no safety issues. But that first question is interpreted by a lot of people to say, we need to have it inspected. You don't.
Well, you guys did all of our paperwork.
Well, in
So
some
when
cases, boards want to do it. And if you didn't, I mean, we also say that when we do a reserve study, we could have looked at it at the same time. So there's a way to consolidate these things, but it does not require that you do an inspection. It just is asking if you've had one done.
Okay, so you guys did both. So my other question is the infrared camera.
Yes.
So we have 30 buildings. You know, we're a dilapidated old condominium, 45 plus years old. So is that something that you would price out per building, per unit?
Well, if you're doing a thermographic analysis of your buildings, I will tell you, it's not much more expensive to do the entire community rather than to do one building, because we fly the community with special cameras for the roofs. And, you know, let's put it this way. If you were to walk every roof of 20 buildings, it's going to take 5 days. If you're going to do thermographic analysis of your buildings, it's going to take a day. So it's a huge savings in the fee with better information.
Cool. Great. Thanks.
No, you're welcome. Anybody else? Come on, there's got to be one other one of these. All right, well, I don't see anything in the chat also. All right, is there standard RFP for new HOP chart initiating the transition? That's from one of the Todds. I think there's 2 Todds, right, with the same names. But what we're going to do is we're going to send you a copy of this presentation. And if you look at that one slide where it says this is what to ask for in the RFP, all you have to do is ask for those things, but give a description of your community in terms of number of buildings, number of units, what are the common elements, and define what the amenities are that are part of the common elements need to be inspected, but just request those specific things that I list there in terms of locations, deficiency, and standard, because that's a key to the whole thing. I've seen some other engineering firms, and as a matter of fact, we do it also sometimes, where they say that this punch list I'm talking about right now is separate. It's not included in the study. I think that punch list that defines these things is probably the most important part of the study. And even if you don't get it initially, once you give the report to the developer, what's the first thing the developer's going to say? Okay, tell me where the problems are and tell me what the problem is. Don't just describe it in words with pictures. So that's why I think that RFP information is very important. Anything else? All right, well, I'm going to put in here my email, and if I get it right, and if anybody has any questions or anybody has any questions, please feel free to email me. If anybody has a community that they'd like us to give a presentation like this to, if you're a management company and you'd like to have an internal presentation to your staff, just let us know. We'd be happy to do it. And you can probably tell I can give this presentation in my sleep, and I think I was last night, but I did add a number of things based on the new CAI public policies, which I think are very important when it comes to building safety. So I see that a lot of people are still here. So you want me to give another webinar? How about one on reserve studies now? What do you think?
Barry had a question about how much law experience we have in PA. And then Elizabeth also wanted to know if there's a code word for the credits.
Just here's the, I'll go to the credits first. This course has been approved by CAI a few years ago for credit. CAI has a law or a rule that says that you have to reapply every few years in order to continue for CEU. We have applied to them at least a month and a half ago for that. They just told us we're missing a little piece of information we gave them. So just send us your name and information. And as soon as we get that, we'll give you the credit. Because you were here, they told us it's approved, it's been approved before. So it's, I'm a little surprised that, because we submitted a few classes, the other one were approved. The other question was what, Jody?
It was how much law experience do we have in Pennsylvania, Kipcon?
Law experience?
Yeah.
Whoever asked that question, we're engineers.
New Jersey law. We were referring to the New Jersey law. How much do we have an experience for Pennsylvania law?
In terms of, well, if you're talking about in terms of the reserves and those type of things, we know what the requirements are in Pennsylvania, but we're not lawyers. So what we're talking about, what we're familiar with is in terms of there really aren't any reserve requirements in Pennsylvania. And I don't even think there's reserve requirements in Pennsylvania for the governing documents to include budgets, if I'm not mistaken. But I think there were a couple of developers here, so they may be able to jump in and confirm that. I will tell you that my experience has been, for some reason, there's a lot less transition litigation in Pennsylvania than in New Jersey. New Jersey, it's turned into, I hate to say it, kind of an industry of let's go after the developer, and no matter what we say, they're going to give us some money. And I don't know why that's happening, but I see a lot of that type of thing going on in New Jersey. And things are built, the same way in Pennsylvania. So all I would say is be very careful. You do not want to end up in litigation. And if I were to make any suggestion, other suggestions, when you interview attorneys to be your transition legal counsel, when you interview engineers to be your prepare your transition study, ask them the question, how many times did their transition studies end up in litigation? Because I think that's a very important, and how many of them are settled, because I've seen reports that are geared towards confrontation from engineers, and I've seen a number of attorneys that, I hate to say it, don't tell me I said this, but they're kind of looking for litigation, they're looking for problems. So be very careful.
Todd had a question about the cost. Is the cost of transition study included in the initial budget provided by the developer?
Great question. I have never seen that done. Never. And although I do know some developers, one in particular, that will generally, if you go to them and say, we're having a transition study done, where they will typically say, we will contribute, if not pay for that transition study, if you use one of these 2 or 3 engineers, because we know their objective. But I've never seen it done. One of the problems also with reserve studies and these periodic inspections is that if you look at a typical community association budget, there's a line item in there for management, there's a line item in there for accounting, there's a line item in there for snow plowing or whatever. There's never, ever, very rarely in there you see a line item for updating reserve studies or periodic inspections and things like that. The new public policy, and we've started doing it, says that the reserve study should include these soft costs. So for example, if we do a reserve study now, we say that it should be updated in 3 years, and let's say hypothetically that the cost of that reserve study is $3,000. We put in the reserve study, update of reserve study, $3,000 with a 3-year life. And you're going to see that throughout the industry because it's a placeholder, not a lot of money, but it's a placeholder away for communities to budget for doing these updates that they should do. Because keep in mind, a reserve study reflects about 40–50% of your overall budget. You want to get it right. You want to keep it adequate. You want to keep it low, and you want to update it. So you're going to start seeing that as part of the public policies and just this, the best practices, that these things are included in the reserve study. So, but that's a great question. If you could get, there's nothing in that new law that says the developer has to include the cost of a transition study in their initial budget. It's not done. Anything else? All right, well, thank everybody. Thank you everybody very much. Are you including inflation in your reserve studies? Another great question. When you get a proposal from us to do a reserve study, we say that we're including 2% inflation, 1% interest in our studies, unless you tell us something different. I know what you're saying or thinking, that based on what's going on with inflation now, it should be more than that. So what we do is if something is going to be replaced in the next couple of years, we'll inflate it based on the current inflationary rates, but going into the future, we'll drop it down based on historical rates. But in some instances, an association says, don't include interest in inflation because we're going to update it every 3 years. It will then take it into effect. But in our proposals, unless you tell us otherwise, right now, we're including 1% interest, 2% inflation. That's a great question. Let's see, my question, how much transition work do we do in Pennsylvania? We do a fair amount. We're working on a number of, as a matter of fact, we have one report that has to get out. We do a fair amount of work in Pennsylvania with transition studies. Anything else? That was a good one about the inflation. It's not only inflation, it's inflation and interest. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. And we're going to send out, if Jody makes me give them all the stuff, which she will, we're going to send out to everybody copies of this presentation as a PDF, as well as the other things I mentioned as part of this webinar. We have another one coming up in a few weeks. I think it might be on reserve funding or something else. But if you're on our email list, you'll be getting it. And you probably got a list of all the upcoming ones we have. So thank you for attending. And like I said, if you're looking for manager's credit, just send us an email. And as soon as that's approved, because it's approved and we just need confirmation, that we'll send you the certificate. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. And we recorded this, so you can get the link from our website if you ever want to see it again. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.